FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz, and today is 9/18/20. Well, we've been hearing a lot of information about drugs, treatments, vaccines, all this COVID-19 stuff you'd probably be happier not ever having heard about. I know that's the way I feel. I'd like to get your views on it, and I've got somebody you're going to want to hear from who's an expert in this area. Just send us an email, kl@kerrylutz.com. And right now with me is Dr. Dean Fanelli. And Dr. Fanelli, you're a PhD expert on pharmaceutical and chemical-related technologies. And so first, getting into the whole COVID-19 issue, as far as drugs, as far as treatments, what's your take on what's happening?
Well, it's great to join you, Kerry. Thank you for having me. We keep hearing about how do we get back to normal? How do we, stop wearing masks? There's all these arguments and all this politicization of these comments. But, we're really moving at an unprecedented pace when it comes to the vaccine development here. The virus's genome was just announced earlier this year in January. Fast forward about 9 months, and we're already talking about candidates and potentially vaccines that would be approved in the next couple months. So typically you're talking about the course of a decade to get a vaccine or a drug approved. Here, we're doing that in the course of a matter of a year. So highly unprecedented, but things are moving extremely quickly. But nonetheless, the FDA, their primary concern is the safety and the efficacy of a vaccine candidate once one is approved.
Right. So we're moving fast on the vaccine front, yet it appears we have treatments available that appear to be very effective. Simple drugs, inexpensive, like hydroxychloroquine, like corticosteroids, other drugs, zinc. All that's been politicized as well. What is your take on hydroxychloroquine?
Yeah, hydroxychloroquine, it hasn't been really shown to be as effective as people had hoped. I mean, I mentioned it's been highly politicized, and, there's certain people out there that swear by it and, just for no other reason, but they're reading anecdotal information. There's been several clinical trials that have been done and that have shown that it doesn't work. There has been one that showed it did work, but nonetheless, in my opinion, I don't think it's where it needs to be. Now, certainly it's an approved drug. So if a doctor feels that a patient that has the virus and is in need of, and then their opinion, they could administer hydroxychloroquine to help this patient, it's in their purview and in their permission to do this off-label, off-indication prescribing of a drug. So certainly that doctor can prescribe it for a patient. But in my opinion, just at large saying, hey, hydroxychloroquine is a therapy that can be used to treat the virus, the data just doesn't show. And in fact, the FDA, it had granted emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine. It withdrew that. So that means, just the data supporting it wasn't there. So hydroxychloroquine, I don't think is really going to get us where we need to be as far as therapeutics go.
Well, we did have the Henry Ford medical system study, and it showed that the mortality rate of those who got hydroxychloroquine early and at the right dosage dramatically decreased. And then we've got numerous studies out there from around the world showing that it's got some efficacy. And really, the drug's been prescribed for so many years. It got politicized, and then it's become impossible in many places to even obtain the drug from a pharmacy. So is that the right way to be handling public policy?
No, it's absolutely not. I mean, you hit it right on the head. I mean, we don't need the politicization of, most politicians, they don't, their legal, law is their specialty. Science is not. So they should, in my opinion, just really stay out of it because, from what I've heard and what the data that I've seen, in my opinion, I don't think it works. But as you point out, there are studies that show that it does have efficacy. And, earlier this year, we saw a lot of doctors and surgeons saying, let us use this drug. So that was what prompted the FDA to grant this emergency use authorization. So, we need to get away from all this politicization of, wearing masks, not wearing masks, what therapeutics work, what don't, and just focus on the data.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, because initially the CDC said don't use corticosteroids for COVID patients. And of course, the emergency room doctors who actually have to treat these people, anytime you go to the hospital and you're having problems breathing, they're going to give you prednisone or some other similar steroid. And they found that these steroids worked. So we've been getting so much crosstalk from the CDC, from WHO, from all of these organizations who we've charged with the responsibility of giving us the accurate information. How are you to believe them? I mean, look at the face mask debate. Now, that's like really, there's a lot of science that says what we're doing is nonsense in most situations, but yet the science isn't really getting considered in the debate for any of this.
That's right. Certainly, dexamethasone has been shown, which is a corticosteroid, has been shown to provide help in patients that are, on a ventilator or receiving oxygen. So there is certainly precedent for using that. And luckily that therapeutic hasn't been really politicized. But, as you mentioned, people, they're hearing wear a mask and they're thinking, why do I need to wear a mask every time I'm outside if I'm just walking down the street? A lot of it's common sense. If you're out for a run, out riding your bike on a golf course, you don't really need a mask. But, if you're in a crowded elevator, obviously, you don't want to be around sick people in a crowded space, where you can pick up the virus. So there will be a situation where I would say, yes, definitely wear a mask. But you're right. A lot of this has, we got to stick to the science. We got to stick to the facts and stop. I mean, everyone has an opinion on this. And unfortunately, most people that are expressing their opinion, really don't look at the data. They don't have backgrounds in science. They're just basically expressing their opinion based on what they've heard in the news, which is really not the right way. And worse off, certain people, whether they have the R or the D after their name, depending on how they vote, that's shaping their opinion as well. And that's just not the way this needs to work in a pandemic, and especially in this situation.
And that's a great point you raise. Let's look at the science. And one of the things that's been pretty well established from a few studies is there's very little chance of outdoor transmission. And yet we have certain governments like Key West, places in Florida, places around the country, which are mandating wearing masks on the sidewalk, outdoors, even if there's nobody around you. Now, that's not based on science.
Yeah, exactly. And you kind of wonder, we're obviously in an unprecedented situation, and you kind of wonder, are people just, doing things because they don't know what to do? So they're just saying things that, okay, they hear wear a mask, and that in their mind it means wear a mask all the time. But, you raise a good point. When you're outside, and at least in my opinion, I agree with you that it's highly unlikely if you're outside, even if you're walking next to someone, that you're going to pick up that virus. Obviously you want to social distance if you can, but outside, very unlikely. Inside, you use caution, use common sense. A lot of these, what we're hearing now, you kind of scratch your head, and it doesn't really, not only does the science not mesh up with it, but it also just doesn't really mesh up with common sense.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, another weakness that's been really illustrated in the whole thing is actual causes of death, and the fact that study came out by the CDC, quietly released, that straight COVID deaths, 6% of the deaths have been just COVID alone with no comorbidities. The remaining 94%, 2 points, on average 2.6 comorbidities per victim, I guess, and that half the deaths took place roughly in nursing homes. So has the whole thing been really hyped out of all proportion to the actual risk?
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next.
Silver One Resources is an exploration and development company backed by strategic investors Eric Sprott and SSR Mining. At Silver One's Candelaria Mine project in Nevada, there is already a historic resource estimated at 127 million ounces of silver, which Silver One is developing and advancing. The company's Phoenix Silver project, located within the Arizona Silver Belt, is an early-stage exploration project on which native silver vein fragments have been discovered near surface. One grab sample assayed an astounding 14,688 ounces per ton. Yes, that's right, ounces, not grams. Silver One has tremendous exploration potential, is extremely leveraged to the price of silver, and is cashed up and poised to increase shareholder value. Silver One trades in New York under the ticker SLVRF and in Toronto under the ticker SVE. To learn more, go to silverone.com. That's silverone.com.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
It's hard to say. I don't think it's been hyped out of proportion. I think, it's certainly we're in a situation where this is a contagious virus. It's more contagious than the flu based on what I've seen and the data that's out there. But you're right. I mean, a lot of this, I don't want to get into conspiracy theories, but it's hard to tell when you see this data and you see 190,000 patients or people have died. It's really important to know, did 190,000 people actually die due to the virus, or was it, a coincidence they had the virus and they also died? Did the virus cause, combined with that comorbidity, as you mentioned, was that the cause of death? So, there's nuances here. And unfortunately, because, time is not really on our side, we're trying to move forward with this vaccine. We have a lot of information that we still really just don't know, because you hear of healthy people that, their best condition of their life, they get the virus and then they pass from it. So there's a lot we don't know. We don't know why the virus attacks people in certain ways. But yeah, you raise a very good point.
Yeah, and we know, like certain things, we do know that the way that deaths have gotten reported for this thing, it's all over the place, because it could just be the doctor's opinion, no test even done to know whether the person had COVID. Even Dr. Burke said that likely 25% of the deaths attributed to COVID probably weren't COVID caused deaths.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's right.
Yeah. So maybe we got to tighten up on how we do death certificates. It seems like a very informal affair right now, which is really more subject to the whims of the doctor preparing the death certificate or other official than based on science there as well.
Yeah, you're right. I couldn't agree with you more. There's, it's very important, especially when we're basically scaring the public and saying, look, this is a deadly virus. People want to know conceptually, how do they put this in terms in their mind? Like, we can think of the flu virus and, that's around every year. 40 to 60 million people get it. Typically around 10 to 15,000 people a year die. Those are numbers we can conceptualize in our head and understand. But you're hearing now, where we see 6-7 million people in the U.S. are infected and 190,000. When we do that math, it seems like it's a much more deadly virus. But you bring up a good point. We don't know the exact number of people that are infected. The statistics are showing people that were actually tested, but we've obviously heard about asymptomatic people recovering, and they may not be included in those numbers. And as you pointed out, the 190,000 plus people that have already died, what's that number specifically? Is it 25% less? Is it 50% less? Or is it more? So it's just very hard when we're getting these numbers out there. And, and I understand doctors, and when they do death certificates, they're not really, thinking about, let me cross-reference this, let me have a blood test and all this. That's typically not what they do. But, you raise excellent points that, we have, if we're going to allege that or assert that this is a deadly virus and it's highly contagious, we need to be able to tell people how deadly and how contagious.
Yeah. I mean, and our leaders here need to know the real facts so that they can actually put together cohesive, coherent policies, which we've seen different states, they're doing different things. At what point is the pandemic over? In New York, there's very few deaths taking place from COVID. Is that a reason to keep everything shut down? all these questions, and there's no science being used to address them to find answers.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it would have been, at least in my opinion, a lot more effective, had there been a more coherent approach at the beginning where, all the governors got together with the federal government and there was, a unified strategy. But it seems like, whatever the flavor of the day is, if one person says something and, they're not on your so-called on your team, the other person's going to say the opposite. And it's just in a public health crisis, even if you aren't convinced it's a pandemic, it's still an issue that we're all dealing with. We need to have a uniform strategy. It doesn't make sense, like you said, to have, a place where they seem to have gotten through this to still be, undergoing the same type of restraints as another place that is, peaking out and has a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, there's just no rhyme or reason to the way it's being addressed. I appreciate this is probably, for the most part, state issue that governors need to address. But you just got insane rules that have come down, and won't even get into you about the whole issue of constitutional rights and the way they've been summarily stripped away. But if you're going to be doing this, if it's really an emergency, then it's got to be data driven, and this just doesn't seem to be.
I agree with you 100%.
So what do we learn from this for the next pandemic, which hopefully will be many decades in the future, but might very well happen next year?
Yeah, when you look back, the Obama administration, in 2009, when they were dealing with the last, what could have been a pandemic, they'll admit that they got very lucky. It sort of wasn't as contagious as it could have been here. Hopefully we're not in this situation for quite a long time, but I would say, at least one thing that hopefully people will learn is that we need a unified, uniform plan to overcome this. And it can't just be a state by state, ad hoc, let's figure this out as we go approach, because it's just not working, and it needs to rely strictly on the science and not this anecdotal data that's really not empirical at all.
Agreed. And hopefully if we learn anything else, we'll learn that the response needs to be data driven and not just, I remember there was a sign in the 60s and it said, don't just stand there, panic, and that's kind of what we have done here. Do something. Just so it looks like you're doing something, whether it's effective or not, kind of besides the point. Dr. Fanelli, we want to find out more about you, check out your work. Where do we go?
So I'm an attorney in Washington at Seyfarth Shaw. You can visit me at the website, Seyfarth, SEYFARTH.com.
All right. Excellent. And there's a link to it in the show notes to this interview. Anybody got a question for Dr. Fanelli or myself? Email us, KL@KerryLutz.com, Twitter feed @KerryLutz, and of course, website, financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Dr. Fanelli, thanks so much for stopping by, and I appreciate your explanations and your coming to grasp with the issue.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Kerry.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.